Welcome to this seminar and webinar Giving Future Generations a Voice. Firstly, as a reflection of our recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, Lutruwita, we wish to acknowledge the traditional owners and the continuing custodians of the land upon which we are meeting, here in Nipaluna, Hobart, and the custodians are the Palawa people, and of the lands that others are joining us from, welcome. We wish to pay our respects to elders past and present and to emerging community leaders. This land was never ceded, and Tasmania's First Nations have fought for justice, firstly simply to recognise their very presence and the truth of invasion and dispossession, and continuing to fight for recognition of their land and traditions and rights. These are people who have an understanding of the need to protect this world for future generations. We seek to listen, learn and walk beside Tasmania's First Nations people to understand the work of protecting this world we live in, not only for us but for future generations. My name is Robin Banks and I want to welcome you all here, and I particularly note the presence of Rosalie Woodruff, Member of Parliament. I'm your moderator and I have a background in human rights and discrimination law, which sort of fits this agenda. I've worked in all of the sectors, community, government and private sector, and I suspect we'll be hearing about the work and role of all of those sectors this evening in ensuring future generations have a voice. We are, of course, seeing increasing agitation by young people who rightly are very concerned about their interests being ignored in the global response to climate change, and particularly in the last couple of weeks. We should multiply that concern 1,000-fold when turning our attention to the needs and interests of future generations, those who are not yet born and who will have to live in the radically changed world we seem destined to leave them. And we need to remind ourselves that their needs and interests are not necessarily the same as those of children and young people living today. Just as the world that we live in, as some of my friends with disability would say, is designed as if people with disabilities are not here or aren't full participants, we also currently live in a world that is designed as if there will be no future generations to be concerned about who have needs, rights and hopes. It is neither appropriate nor fair to place the burden of ensuring consideration of the needs of future generations on the shoulders of the current generations of children and young people. We all must be part of finding ways to do this as a society, both locally, here in Tasmania, and globally. How can we reshape, reimagine and create institutions and processes that can lead us to better ways? And what can we do here in Tasmania? What about our place and ways of doing can provide opportunities? The challenge of responding effectively to climate change is just one of the public policy issues where future generations are absent from the debates. And yet this will be their world and these will be their societies. Breaking out of short-term cycles of decision-making and institutional bias will be key to effective, just and inclusive action. Tonight, our panellists will look at the case for reform to our approaches and real-world options for institutions to give future generations a voice, and so to be part of the solution, not the problem. Climate change will be a consistent theme throughout the presentations, but the issue of giving future generations a voice goes beyond it to other forms of pollution and environmental destruction, to child poverty, global economic disparities, disease prevention and treatment, and many more. It's about, as Derek Bell noted, duties owed to people not because they are alive, but because they could be harmed. We will hear from the speakers whose biographies you've already had access to, so I'm not going to repeat them. We'll have time after the speakers for a discussion, and for those who are joining us online, please use the chat function on your system to put your questions and further discussion points that will be raised in that discussion time. For those who are online, please ensure your sound is muted during the presentations. And for those in the room, please ensure your phones are silent. And if you do need to take a call for urgent reasons, please try and wait till you get outside the room before you answer it. Thanks for that. So Without further ado, I want to ask you to join me in welcoming our first presenter, Dr. Peter Lawrence, Senior Lecturer in Law at the University of Tasmania. Peter.
Thank you very much, Robin, for taking on this role today. And also thank you for those involved in the organisation of this event. Really delighted to be here. Now, I just wanted to set the scene a little bit about the sorts of institutions that we've been writing and researching about. Tasmania, neither Tasmania nor federally in Australia, is there a commissioner type institution purporting to represent future generations. Around the world, there are relatively few such institutions. There was one for a period of time in Israel, there is one in Hungary. There are some institutions that implicitly represent future generations, but have a mandate more related to the environment. And New Zealand's Parliamentary Commission for the Environment is an example of such an institution. And then there are some institutions that have a sustainability focus and implicitly represent future generations as part of sustainability. And there are some examples in Australia. There are such institutions in the ACT in Victoria. Canada has such some institutions of this sort. Now, the global level, to date, there's not been established a commissioner for future generations. But just last month in New York, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, announced that he would be creating a special envoy for future generations, as well as a raft of other institutional reforms related to young people. Now, I want to focus very briefly today on why we should create such institutions. So what's the normative argument for creating such institutions? Now, and why does this normative argument matter? As my good colleague, Jonathan Boston, who's with us today from New Zealand by Zoom, as Jonathan has pointed out in his writings, to create such institutions, you need minimal support in society on an ethical obligation owed to future generations. Without that bedrock of agreement, then you'll never get off the ground any of these sorts of institutions. Now, there have been various proposals made as to the best normative basis for these institutions. I'd like to just make very briefly an argument that rests on core human rights, but is also linked to the notion of bias. Now, bias is bad. Bias is bad. You can all think of examples of bias that irritate the hell out of you. And that's because bias is linked to unfairness, treating people unfairly. Now the basis of my argument is that future generations are being treated very badly, so there's extensive institutional bias against their interests, and we can see evidence of this everywhere. You've only got to look at the outcomes of the COP26 meeting in Glasgow. Yes, there's been some progress in terms of trying to dismantle fossil fuel subsidies, but we've still got an enormous distance to go. And the Australian government, of course, last year we have in this country nearly more than $7 billion of subsidies for fossil fuels. So that's an example of bias against the interests of future generations. Scientists point out that we have more than 1 million species endangered worldwide, and human beings are reliant on functioning ecosystems. And so that's another example of bias. Now, if we agree that there is this bias, then the next step of the argument is to bias assumes some sort of reference point of fairness. So what is the fairness? What type of fairness or justice argument are you going to make? My argument is that the most convincing argument is one based on core human rights. And the basic idea here is that all persons, regardless of when and where they are born, are entitled to core human rights to life, health, and subsistence, and that those rights continue into the future. And they then ground an obligation to respect those rights on current generations. And so the argument here is that we should create institutions that allow proxy representation of future generations to represent those future generations and provide a mechanism for countering the bias. Bias is bad, and we need some way of countering this bias. Now, we shouldn't overstate this argument. Of course, the preferable approach would be to incorporate the interests of future generations into existing policy making and institutions. That would be the best option, but that's not happening. So the argument I'd like to leave you with is that there are good, firstly, that the normative arguments matter, and secondly, that we can make a strong argument that based on core human rights that have wide consensus agreement internationally, that this can provide a convincing basis for creating these institutions that specifically purport to represent the interests of future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. You were on time. Beautifully done. Thank you. Please join me in thanking you. And now I'll turn to our screen, or you'll turn to the screens, and welcome Associate Professor Bridget Lewis from the School of Law at Queensland University of Technology. Welcome, Bridget.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks very much for having me. Sorry I can't be there in person. I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am, the Turrbal and Yagara people. I'm located right beside the banks of the Maiwar in beautiful Meanjin, Brisbane. So I'd like to extend my respects to elders there as well. So I'm going to pick up from where Peter left off, because I am firmly of the view that human rights is a useful space to be working in when we're talking about these sorts of institutions. And I think, as Peter says, human rights provides us with a really good normative basis or rationale for these sorts of institutions. And I also, I guess, want to take the next step and think about what human rights can do, how it can help when we're designing an institution that's going to give a voice to future generations. So what sorts of human rights principles can we draw on, not only to give us the justification for the institution in the first place, but also then to start thinking about how the institution might look and how it might work. So my area of interest is obviously in human rights, but specifically in environmental rights. So I'm really interested in these questions from the perspective of issues like climate change, but also environmental problems like fracking and nuclear waste and plastics. That we're just really good at doing things for short-term gain and ignoring the burden that we're creating for future generations. So I'm interested, I guess, in how we might build an institution that gives us a better shot at balancing short-term benefits against long-term burdens and striking a fairer balance for future generations. So as a starting point, and this is kind of, I worked through this in the chapter in the book in a little more detail, the fundamental principle of human rights, that is universality, I think is really important here, because we're talking about the fact that human rights belong to all people without discrimination, so without that sort of bias that Peter's just been talking about. And a second key idea in human rights is the idea of indivisibility, that we all have the full range of human rights. And I think it's really important to recognise not only that future generations will enjoy human rights or are entitled to human rights just as much as we are, but also that they're entitled to all of the same human rights that we enjoy. And so even though we might not know exactly what their needs will be, we can use those core human rights to start to identify factors that we should be more conscious of, those sorts of interests that future generations will have. And I think that can feed into an institution like this, so that we're really, I guess, forced to turn our minds to how our actions and decisions might impact on that full range of human rights that future generations are entitled to. The other important part of a human rights approach is that it has both a legal and a moral dimension. So morally, once we start appreciating that future generations have human rights, that creates a really strong obligation on us not to act in a way which knowingly undermines their ability to enjoy those rights. The problem we have, though, is that moral obligation hasn't been translated into strong legal obligations. So it's actually, I mean, I think it's really easy for countries to get away with impacting on the rights of future generations, because we don't have mechanisms that enforce those rights or allow us actually to stand up for future generations' interests. And that's particularly the case within international human rights. There's just no real recognition of future generations there at all. And so I think we're probably a lot better served thinking about institutions at the national or local level, rather than trying to make change at the international level, which is something that I talk about in a bit more detail in the chapter. The other thing I think that human rights can do is provide us with standards and principles to shape the design of these sorts of institutions. And in that sense, I think rights like freedom of information, equality before the law, non-discrimination, all of those kind of key principles can help us to design an institution that's not just effective, but also has legitimacy, can enhance the accountability and transparency within an organisation like that. And I think if we're mindful of those sorts of principles, we can come up with an idea that's likely to get that kind of support at the community level, the political and community support that's necessary to make it work. So I will wrap it up there because I've had my warning, but that's, I guess, a bit of a flavour for how I can see human rights principles feeding into and supporting an institution for future generations.
Thank you so much, Bridget, and please join me in thanking Bridget. Our next speaker is Nikki Van Dyke, PhD candidate at the Faculty of Law at the University of Tasmania.
Thank you, Robin. So my research is in how we can represent future generations, and a question that I very often get is like, but how do we know what future generations want? Which I think is a really kind of a strange question, because we know they need safe water, we know they need a fertile soil, we know they need a safe climate. We know all these things, but for some reason we don't realize it enough. And I think this really shows that that short-term thinking is so embedded in every aspect of our lives. So, for example, our economy is really focused on profit. We assume that the resources that we use don't really have any long-term effects, which is a bit strange. And in our politics, they're so influenced by lobbyists, and all the politics, of course, they want to be re-elected in 4 years, so they need to have short-term results and stay popular. We have media that focuses on what happens today or maybe yesterday, but it doesn't observe those long-term trends that go on over time and it kind of slip in, like climate change. And my background is in philosophy, and I just find it really interesting to see how our philosophy and the ethics that we use today, what we think is right or wrong, how they were shaped very much by the philosophers and their living conditions at that moment in which they made it. So ethics was made at a time when we couldn't influence the long-term future, simply because humans weren't equipped to do that. We didn't have the technologies and the globalization that come with it. So the theories that we use to decide what is good or bad are very much focused on individual freedoms or on pleasure maximization, those kind of things. But it completely leaves out the importance of a community instead of just individuals, or any obligations that we have to non-human agents or people far away from us in distance or in time. And last, like Peter already talked about it, bias is bad, but indeed, like our brains are literally hardwired to kind of turn a blind eye to all the long-term costs that are going to happen, and they get really excited about all the short-term benefits. So my research really focuses on how can we change the incentive structure in our society, particularly in our legal institutions, to make sure that those biases in our brains, in our economic systems, in our ethics, in all these aspects of life, that they don't really influence our decision making that much anymore. And an example that I'm particularly excited about is using citizens' assemblies to do so. So instead of politicians making decisions, it is citizens, ordinary people, maybe even including children, which would be great, sitting in a room together, learning about a topic, for example, climate change, then chatting about the topic, for example, climate change, and then coming up with recommendations. And because there's no influence of lobbyists, of politicians, of media, of all the other things, they can kind of create decisions or can make recommendations free from all the other incentives that would otherwise make it more short-term oriented. Yeah, so I'm particularly interested, like I think commissioners for future generations and those kind of institutions really focused on future generations are important, but I'm also interested to see how we can change our institutions more broadly to make them more long-term oriented. Yeah.
Thank you, Nikki. So again, our next speaker is online, Professor Jonathan Boston from Victoria University of Wellington. Thank you, Peter. Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Robin. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And many thanks for the invitation to contribute to this event. Congratulations to Jan and Peter in particular on the symposium which they organised back in June 2019. And the elegant edited volume which emerged from that event. The book, as everyone I'm sure in the audience and on the panel realises, addresses one of the most critical issues of our time, namely how do we hear the voice and protect the interests of future generations. Now, in this context, Jan has asked me to comment briefly on legislatures and future generations, which is in fact the theme of her lucid and informative chapter in the book. But it is also a topic that I've reflected on in recent years, partly in response to a request from the clerk of the House of Representatives here in Wellington, David Wilson, when he asked me several years ago to provide some advice to our Parliament on how Parliament could improve the quality of its scrutiny of the country's long-term governance. And I worked with a team of people from his office and the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies on that several years ago. In the short time I've got, I'd just like to make 4 key points about legislatures and future generations. The first is that legislatures matter, probably blindingly obvious. They are an absolutely crucial institution in our system of democratic governance. And as Jan highlights in her chapter, they play at least 4 main roles. They represent the diverse interests of citizens, particularly voters, and that doesn't obviously include future generations or the young. They enact legislation, they authorize taxation and expenditure, and they scrutinize the executive. If legislatures are not representing the interests of future generations and not seeking to protect long-term interests, including the interests of nature, then that obviously leaves a huge gap in our system of long-term governance. So legislatures matter. Secondly, legislatures, and especially those in parliamentary systems of the kind that we're familiar with, tend to be dominated and constrained by the executive branch. And that's all the more likely in contexts where governments have a majority of the members of the parliament, where there's a single chamber as opposed to having dual chambers, an upper chamber and so forth, and where the chamber has relatively few MPs, or it's a modest number of MPs. Here in Wellington, Parliament has only 120 MPs. I appreciate that by Tasmanian standards, that's quite a lot, but it's not very many from a global perspective. And having only 120 MPs severely limits the capacity of our parliament here and parliaments of a similar kind to really undertake the scrutiny function, which is a crucial part of the overall role of legislatures. Third point is that parliamentarians, as I'm sure people will be aware, generally have quite busy and demanding lives. They are inevitably driven by political and electoral incentives, which are mostly short-term, and they have relatively little time for independent policy analysis and in-depth reflection. And in keeping with this, relatively few legislatures, to my knowledge at least, have given systematic attention to the issue of how best to represent future generations or long-term interests. The Finnish parliament, the Eduskunta, is a notable exception. It established, as some of you will be aware, a dedicated committee for the future almost 3 decades ago. A key role of that committee is to review the 4-yearly government statement on long-term issues, which itself is an interesting requirement, and also to conduct inquiries into the major long-term policy challenges facing Finland, both international and domestic issues. It's hard to assess the effectiveness of the Committee for the Future, but several independent evaluations have concluded that it has contributed positively to Finland's policy ecosystem, including the undertaking of foresight, and has helped bring certain important long-term issues to the fore that might otherwise have received more limited attention in Finland. The fourth key point I want to make is that parliaments are relatively conservative institutions which are slow to undertake innovative internal reforms. It's thus perhaps no surprise that few other legislatures around the world have followed Finland in creating a dedicated future-focused committee, even though many parliamentarians around the world are familiar with the Finnish model. Indeed, many have visited Finland. There are, of course, some committees that focus on long-term issues, such as sustainable development committees, but to my knowledge, actually no other country has followed exactly the Finnish model. And the conservative nature of legislatures was certainly brought home to me here a couple of years ago. In the report that I helped prepare back in 2019, our team recommended, or at least made, dozens of suggestions for reform, including changes to our select committee structures and processes, to the idea of having debates on long-term issues in the House, to improving the quality and quantity of support services for Parliament so that it could better undertake its scrutiny functions. But when the Standing Orders Committee reviewed standing orders last year, very few of the suggestions we made were adopted, not helped, I suspect, by COVID-19, but also not helped by the influence of some long-standing members of the Standing Orders Committee who are or were of a very conservative nature, small c conservative. Finally, can I just say, despite disappointments and setbacks and the challenges we face in trying to make our parliaments more proactive in protecting long-term interests, it is obviously imperative that we press on, but we need to be strategic in what we do and recommend selecting reform options that are likely to be politically feasible, as well as having a reasonable prospect of actually improving the quality of our long-term governance and the representation of the interests of future generations. So thank you for the opportunity to contribute, and I look forward to the further contributions this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Dr. Philippa McCormick, postdoctoral researcher at Adelaide Law School and adjunct professor at the University of Tasmania Faculty of Law. Philippa.
I just had a massive, well, not a pay rise, but a huge promotion. It's not a professor. I'm an adjunct lecturer at UTAS. That'd be super awesome if they just appointed you a professor. Not a professor. Although let's keep that for tonight. I'm happy to go with that. So I want to acknowledge the fact that I have the enormous privilege of living and working on Muanina country here in Tassie in Lutruwita, but I work for the University of Adelaide remotely, and that is firmly located on unceded country, cared for and nurtured by the Kaurna people for millennia. So I'm excited about the opportunity to be here tonight because I'm a little bit of a, I don't really fit in this kind of company. I don't work on human rights at all. Obviously, they are very important, but they are not my space at all. I'm a climate adaptation and biodiversity conservation scholar, and I teach in administrative law. And so Jonathan spoke beautifully about the role of parliaments, of the legislature, of how they have a really important task to make sure that we sort of think ahead to future generations. But my work is in relation to the executive. Talk about the executive, that's kind of government, right? So once Parliament passes a piece of legislation and says, here's what we're going to do, government have a role in drafting that, but then also in implementing it. So that's ministers of government, but also public servants and officials within the government, day-to-day, ordinary things. And I think that the key message that I want to convey in my very short presentation is that if we think about future generations in the way that we make decisions, we will improve the environment that future generations inherit, the places that they live, the nature that they see and experience. But that long-term thinking has the opportunity to dramatically improve the nature of decision-making right now. If we could look past the next election cycle and wonder about what impact a particular decision might have on our country and our people and our vision and our strategy for generations to come, what a different set of decisions might be made. So it's an exciting opportunity to think about that. In terms of decision making, obviously governments play a really huge role in our lives. The decisions are just everywhere in your life. So they make decisions about tax law that kind of incentivise certain activities and disincentivise other activities. Make decisions about long-term planning for health and education. My own deep concern, like almost everybody who's not in government, is about climate change and making decisions about whether, how and where future coal mines might be opened up and coal markets might be exploited. And I noticed just in recent kind of media, some of our federal politicians have been talking about our customer countries, which is a very strange way to conceive of our engagement on the world stage. But so they're making short-term decisions about kind of emergency management, medium-term decisions, and really decisions with very long-term implications. And a lot of the time, those decisions are influenced by their electorate, those that are lobbying them, and so on. So if we could sort of encourage or force decision makers within government to think much more longer term, that has huge implications, not just for the environment later on, but also for how our decisions are made now. There are sort of two other brief things that I want to touch on, and one of them is that once Parliament's done its thing, created a piece of legislation that then goes to a decision maker in government to make decisions about. And I'm going to use one that I'm much more familiar with than many others, and that's the Federal Environment Act, the EPBC Act, we call it for short. When the Parliament did its thing, made the EPBC Act and sent it off to the Environment Department to administer. It's then the role of people within that department to make sure that they comply with the provisions that are in it. And so when, for example, you have a little provision that says the minister has to make a decision about a proposal to open a coal mine, there are certain things in that legislation the minister has to think about. There are some things they're not allowed to think about, and there are other things that they can think about if they want to. And at the moment, future generations is something that they can think about if they want to, and place the kind of weight they want to on it. So they could be making decisions that explicitly take into account the impact of that decision on future generations. But the pressure to make decisions that benefit us now is really strong. So one of the opportunities, or one of the ways that in the absence of an institution for future generations, explicitly sort of in that federal sphere. One of the ways that we are seeing that change is through litigation. And I don't want to speak at length about it, but I'm happy to answer a question about it. We had a decision by the federal court really recently that saw the court imply a relationship between the minister making a decision about a coal mine and young people. The court said when you make decisions about things that are going to increase climate change and cause a decrease in life expectancy and poorer health outcomes for young people, you have to think about those people when you make that decision. And it's been appealed, so it might not stand. But it's a really encouraging step. I think it demonstrates that young people, that people amongst our community now are actually thinking about the future and demanding a better way of decision making. And the opportunity exists for us to have an institution which would play an accountability role. When you made that decision, you didn't think about that thing. I'm going to tell everyone, and it's going to come back to bite you. Change the way you make your decisions, or maybe like a facilitative role, right? So when you make these decisions, here's some great frameworks and guidance and tools you can use to do it better. So Cleo, with whom I wrote a chapter in the book, and it was an absolute delight to work with her, is going to talk a little bit about what we can learn. So the other aspect of our chapter was what we can learn from an institution that's already in place in Australia.
Phil, have you... For me to carry on, Robin. Thanks for that. Thanks for the introduction. I had two introductions. No, I just did fine. That's totally fine. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Robin. And I'm thrilled to be here today. Hello to everybody here. Nice to see you all, and to those online. It's wonderful to be part of these very important discussions and to have been part of this fabulous book that Jan and Peter have put together. We've heard so far today on why we need institutions for future generations and the normative basis for that, the principles that may underpin them, and the existing decision-making context that exists, that the executive government exercises on a day-to-day basis. As Philippa mentioned, I'm going to talk to you today about one institution in Australia, the Commonwealth Ombudsman, that's an existing accountability mechanism from which we can learn some important lessons for the establishment of a new institution for future generations. So, I'm going to recap a little bit. I'm going to provide a very short overview on the Ombudsman for those who are not familiar with the institution. We could talk for a long time about that, but I'll keep it very brief. There is an Ombudsman in each of the state and territories in Australia, but I'm going to focus today mostly on the federal Commonwealth Ombudsman, to clarify. And that position of the Commonwealth Ombudsman was established in 1976, and it is an independent government body whose role it is to essentially oversee the workings of the executive government. And its purpose is to improve public administration and ensure the fair and accountable administrative action of executive government. So essentially we can sort of think of the Ombudsman a bit like a middle person between an ordinary citizen and government on the other hand. And it gives, it's a free and informal and relatively easy to access mechanism that gives a voice to citizens to be able to engage with government. So the way that it fulfills its mandate in overseeing government and improving public administration varies. It has a few different modes of operation. Essentially, it responds to individual complaints about government. It can also act proactively on its own motion to investigate more systemic issues of administration. And it has an oversight, an audit role, which is growing, of certain functions of government as well. So it has a reactionary role. It reacts in the way it performs its functions, and also a proactive role. And it has quite a broad discretion in the way that it acts and how it chooses to fulfil its mandate and best improve public administration in each case. It also, in the way that it carries out its role, it essentially performs a standard-setting role for improving public administration, which is something that a future generations institution could also presumably do. But today I want to talk about 3 key lessons that we can take from looking at both the strengths of the Commonwealth Ombudsman and some of the challenges that it's faced in recent years, and how these may inform a new institution. So it's the kind of nuts and bolts of how an institution may operate. And first of all, the first thing to highlight essentially to provide an overview of these three key lessons is that a new institution must be capable of evolving to meet changing circumstances. And we've seen that based on the pressures, for example, that the Commonwealth Ombudsman has faced in recent times in terms of questions of independence, of limited funding with a corresponding increase in responsibilities. We know that a new institution for future generations is going to be established in a potentially contentious context. Potentially, we can assume that given how we're seeing the media play out with climate change at the moment. And issues that it will touch on will also be contentious involving future generations. So here we need to make sure that it is it's feasible, but it's also capable to evolve. And now, the first lesson that we can take from the Ombudsman, more specifically, is the importance of having a broad mandate for a new institution for future generations. The Ombudsman itself has been very successful in adapting to change since its inception. It's had a lot of different pressures placed on it, and it's had to adapt with changes in funding, changes in political priorities, and growing responsibilities. And here we can apply this to a new institution for future generations and can see that having a broad mandate like the Ombudsman does, the Ombudsman can look into matters of administration, so that's a pretty broad general ambit of their work, and that basically looks at how governments perform their work on a day-to-day basis. And we see that having such a broad mandate is actually very facilitative of its work. And so similarly, an institution for future generations could have a broad mandate that was facilitative and provided a clear legal foundation for their work without being too prescriptive. So for example, having broad values such as stewardship, intergenerational equity, well-being and sustainability as the foundational values and principles that underpin the institution's mandate could provide that ongoing certainty and stability and the legal basis for its mandate without being too prescriptive about what those values mean. So this would give the institution flexibility for these norms and values to evolve. So we know that already issues around law, policy and ethics for future generations are very much evolving, having established values, but ones that are capable of evolving as we continue to understand them and flesh these concepts out, particularly in terms of human rights, for example, will give the institution a solid basis. Secondly, sorry, Robert, I didn't say that. Thanks. It's important that the institution is able to be flexible in the way it operates. The Ombudsman, for example, is able to triage the approach it takes based on the case in front of it. It can look at different individual complaints and say, actually, I'm going to go and do a systemic investigation on my own motion because that's the best use of my resources, of my limited resources, for example. And this is certainly an important lesson to, as I said, to adapt to those changing pressures on institutions in this context. Thirdly, another key lesson from the Ombudsman is the importance of structural independence of these types of institutions. The Ombudsman, this is something the Ombudsman has been criticised about in the past. So the Ombudsman is appointed by the Governor-General and has a certain level of independence, but certainly there are areas for improvement. And ideally an institution would be headed by an officer of the Federal Parliament, appointed by both Houses of Parliament and reporting to an independent parliamentary committee that oversees its funding, for example. There's a lot more that we could cover here, but these are sort of some three key lessons that we talk about a lot more in the book as well. I want to leave you, perhaps not on a happy note, but one that is a realistic one that we need to think about in the context of the current political context we see, where in the media just in the last few weeks we've seen a lot of enthusiasm for acting and responding to climate change by governments, but not necessarily a lot of political will to put into place concrete actions. And it reminded me of in the context of the Ombudsman, of a well-known quote from one of Australia's leading administrative law experts, Dennis Pearce, when he said that to have an Ombudsman makes the government look good, to underfund the office ensures it is not too troublesome. And it's important that we keep these kind of sentiments in mind with the creation of a new institution to make sure that it has a clear legal mandate and the practical tools to ensure it remains adaptable and independent in what is often a contentious and challenging political environment.
Thank you, Claire. And last but certainly not least, Jan Linehan. adjunct researcher at the University of Tasmania Faculty of Law. Jan.
Thank you. So one of the goals for this seminar was to look at real-world options for institutions to represent future generations. And so we've heard some discussion around citizens' assemblies, parliamentary reform, ombudsman, human rights bodies. And so I'm going to look at the idea of a dedicated Future Generations Commissioner using the model from Wales in the UK. And then I'll end with some general remarks. So since 2015, Wales has had a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which requires the Welsh Government, that is ministers and public bodies, to consider the interests of future generations in performing their functions. So the Act uses the framework not of human rights, but of sustainable development to do this. It defines the principle of sustainable development to include looking at the long term so as not to compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's quite a complex act, so I'm not going to say too much more about it. But one of the key things that the Act does, as well as imposing obligations on decision makers, is to create a commissioner and an office for future generations. And this office is designed to work with the government, so it's not really operating as an ombudsman, but as an independent statutory advisor to a government, as I said. So it's doing this across 7 areas of well-being goals. And it's worth reading them out because they give a really broad context and a nuanced understanding to what might be to consider the well-being of future generations. So Wales is to be prosperous, resilient, healthier, more equal, have cohesive communities, vibrant culture and Welsh language, and be a globally responsible Wales. So the Commissioner, as I said, is not really operating as an ombudsman. They're operating as an advisor to government. They have a broad subject matter, and that includes giving advice on climate change. So that's not to say that that's their primary function, but it's explicitly mentioned in the legislation for obvious reasons. Now, the current Commissioner, Sophie Howe, has been very active since she was appointed in 2016. And this goes to an important point that Bill de Montclair was saying, is about you have to look behind the institution and ask questions about, do we have strong leadership if we want them to work? So Sophie Howe has really been quite extraordinary in raising the profile of future generations. She's worked with the Wales community, including many younger people, and she's focused, and this goes back to the legislative task that she was given, really on how to bring future generations into public sector planning and policy making. She's also made she's made a number of reports on different issues, not just related to the environment, but of issues that have come up before, child poverty, education, and in many ways Wales is a little bit like Tasmania, and we can perhaps talk about that later, because that's something that people don't realise. But she's made these very public interventions more recently on climate change. She's talked about certain controversial planning decisions that the government was making. She's gone beyond the sort of usual invocations, somebody must do something about climate change, to saying we need to talk about funding. We need to fund these kinds of things. So she's had a very practical approach. In terms of that core mandate of transforming the public sector and decision makers, I think and whether that's been effective, I think the jury is still out, or it's an open question. And it's early days, and certainly some have criticised the work of the public service boards in trying to grapple with actually making that shift, considering what future generations need. And I think that's something that we're all struggling with in some ways, to move beyond these paradigms of decision making that are very rooted in both our conceptions of government and our neoliberal model in society. Having said that, there's a lot of proposals that could bolster the work of a Future Generations Commissioner, including changes in approaches to planning, longer timeframes than the 25 years that the Welsh Parliament has mandated as a frame to consider future generations, having a citizens' assembly to advise the Commissioner. So this model is a real-world option for other countries. There are a number of parliamentarians in the UK who are promoting the idea of a Future Generations Commissioner, and they've developed very comprehensive legislation, which is now before the House of Lords and the House of Commons. It's also been mentioned in the UN, and as Peter mentioned, there is also a push now in the UN to develop more of these institutions. So how politically feasible is this kind of model? Well, governments are pretty allergic to rights and institutions, and sometimes governments have good points to make. They're expensive to run, but institutions are pretty central to everything that we do. So there are lots of lessons from Wales. There's a fantastic book by Ruth Davidson, if anyone is interested in reading how they got the legislation through, because there's a process of consultation and engagement with politicians and community. Language is critical. They've chosen the words well-being rather than the more contested words of rights. I think the other thing that we could say generally about this as a real-world option is these institutions cannot solve climate change, but what they can do is legitimate consideration of the interests and rights of future generations, and they can help us engage our community and our politicians in a discussion around these things and hold them to account as decision makers. And I think that they can help us actually work out what it means to make that transformation I talked about, where we can change the way we think about making decisions and long-term planning. And there's a lot of different options here. So I'd suggest that really where our political institutions, our democracy, our administrative institutions are really challenged by many different things at the moment, including climate change. And it's not an easy task to think how we might respond to these things, but this is something that we actually owe to ourselves and to future generations to do. And we can do this as citizens. We can engage in this process. So thank you.
Okay, so we've got about 20 minutes for questions, and I'm going to thank you. You have a question?
The internet does.
Yes, okay. Oh, you'll need a microphone.
I think that's Indira's.
Better work up there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, it's too late. It'll be too late.
Testing. Okay. We have an open question for all panellists. It's from Rowan, and it says, please speak more on the implications of the Sharma decision. Environment Minister Susan Ley nonetheless approved 3 new coal mines in a single month following, sidestepping a duty of care using the drug dealer's defence in her statement of reasons, essentially saying that if we don't mine and burn that coal, somebody else will. Can this seriously be a viable legal strategy for evading responsibility and justice for future generations?
So, I don't want to speak actually in great detail about the Sharma decision because this Thursday, I think it is, the Sandy Duncanson lecture is all about that. And I think that the lawyer who led the case will be giving or leading the presentations a bunch of young people on the panel. So my first response is go to that. You can go live, face to face, or you can go online, and it's going to be amazing. Clearly, my perspective is that approving 3 new coal mines without the minister turning her mind specifically to the interests of young people, let alone future generations, is completely unacceptable. Particularly now, even 20 years ago, but now especially, oh my goodness, what are we doing? And I've been writing about biodiversity conservation for quite a long time, and I always start by saying, oh my goodness, if we stopped burning coal, we would be in a better position. Also, if we did what we said we were going to do. Also, though, there's some really important things that we need to introduce. So I think it's very clear that that's unacceptable now. But the other part of the question was about the drug dealers' defence, which is a really interesting thing to raise because in Australia we don't have kind of a piece of legislation or a constitutional recognition of human rights, and so litigation about climate change has been testing all of these different sort of tools. How do we make sure that this starts to get represented in law, even though there's been deadlock in politics? And so the drug dealers' defence is something that's been challenged over and over again in the context of mine approvals. And there's a great decision by the New South Wales Land and Environment Court. Chief Judge Preston of that court has written this really long decision, and it absolutely brilliantly pulls apart the drug dealers' defence and basically comes to the conclusion that might have been something that got off the ground in the past, but there is no longer space to argue the drug dealers' defence in current litigation about climate change. Coal mines, they have huge impacts on people, on the wellbeing of people who live in the area. They have huge implications for climate change. And in the Sharma decision, what we saw was the judge quantifying the amount of time that young people would have less, so the reduction in life expectancy, the increasing health implications of climate change, and the reductions in the amount of money they were going to make. Like, that's all being quantified. We know it has climate change has direct implications for young people and future generations. And we can tie emissions to climate impacts. So the loop is closed. It's past time. And I really recommend you have a look at the Rocky Hill or the Gloucester decision by Chief Judge Preston. It's a really great one. Not something that has to be followed by the federal government, but I'm looking forward to seeing that argument being absolutely dismantled by, maybe not for a while yet, but by the High Court one day. Because yeah, I mean, it doesn't make sense now, if it ever made sense.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question, and it's not necessarily to you, Philippa. So Sharma and the other litigation we're seeing depend on individuals having the courage to challenge government generally, but sometimes other players, and risk, if they lose, costs and all the other things. And obviously there's lots of crowd-based funding for defence funds, or not defence funds, the opposite, plaintiff funds. Are there any mechanisms that exist that you are aware of where standing exists for a statutory authority or somebody else to take those claims on behalf of not just young children and young people, but future generations? Or is that a yet to be developed option?
I don't know. Although the question about standing, so it's kind of one of the gates you have to get through before you can bring litigation, and you have to demonstrate that you're the right person, that you have the expertise or the connection with the issue, so that you can make the case well. Because in our system, we have this adversarial system. You need to have all of the information really tested and put before a decision maker. So we want the best people to be bringing cases. And standing, the rules about standing, I don't think would currently allow somebody to represent future generations. I could be wrong about that, but what we could have is if there was an institution that was given that responsibility, then they could then that's a connection that institution, that person, that commissioner has. They can go to the court and say, I am the person that is best placed to make this argument. So you could statutorily change that. But at the moment, like a person saying, I care a lot about future generations would definitely not be able to bring that litigation. So you'd have to create that. Yeah.
Just a couple of things on this. I think it's really interesting looking at what's happened in the Netherlands in the Agenda decision, which involved Agenda, an NGO, and as far as I remember, Nick, you might be able to correct me on this, I thought Agenda did purport to represent both young people and future generations. Now that Agenda decision, which went all the way up to the equivalent of our High Court in the Netherlands, decided that the Netherlands' emission reductions were insufficient based on, and it was linked to a negligence, so duty of care argument, but also obligations flowing from the right to life under the European Convention on Human Rights. And then the court decided to comply with these various obligations, plus a provision of the Netherlands Constitution that required the Netherlands to remain habitable. The Netherlands government had to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within a certain scope, within a certain range. They didn't say exactly what they have to do because that would conflict with separation of powers. Now in Australia, I think a strong limitation we have here is that we don't have a Bill of Rights federally. However, in those state jurisdictions where there are human rights charters, so Queensland, ACT and Victoria, I think there's very interesting possibilities. And there's already a case in Queensland. I don't know if Bridget might want to say a few words about the Queensland ongoing litigation. But this does relate to the other standing thing that's interesting too. I think in some of the international proposals for an UN commissioner back over the last decade, some NGOs proposed that such a commissioner could bring cases before the International Court of Justice on behalf of future generations, which would be wacko. Well, not wacko, it'd be great, but governments run a mile. So, and I think this gets back to the Cleo's point in a way that the stronger the powers you give to these institutions, the more the politicians get nervous. But standing is really, I think there's scope for more creative arguments and ideas around standing. I don't know if Bridget wants to comment.
Thank you, Bridget. Did you want to add to that?
I would just I guess make one observation, and that is that I think the comments about standing are all really important ones. In Queensland, the legislation that we have, I'm very proud of Queensland for having a Human Rights Act now, and one of the really I think important components of that is the right to culture, and particularly the right of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to culture. And that's one of the rights that's being picked up in this litigation. It's challenging a coal mine that's being proposed by Clive Palmer. And I think that right might prove to be our best bet for getting decisions that are rights-based decisions that might prevent a coal mine from going ahead, and potentially allowing some of these longer-term considerations to get some traction, because it focuses so much more on the environmental impacts than on individualised direct impacts on people's lives. It allows for a broader, more community-focused, more nuanced understanding of what happens when we dig up coal. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
Thank you. And we have a question up the back.
Thank you, and thank you for your enthusiasm. It's been a very interesting talk. My question is to the practicalities of getting something like this up and running. The likelihood of government actually bringing in a commissioner of anything, but specifically relating to future generations in the near future is probably fairly limited, not something that we can expect to happen. So do we need to look more at forcing their hand, for want of a better word, by creating a public-run commissioner that would be perhaps filled by people of academia, citizens, young citizens, that would actually go through and analyse all the decisions that have been made, or at least current decisions, and say to them, if you had a commissioner, this is what they would be saying, and this is what we need to have done, and for you to consider for future work.
Thank you very much. Does somebody want to have a go at answering that? And I know that we've got Rosalie would like.
Yeah, the point of how feasible is it to start an institution, I think is a really good point. They call it the bootstrap hypothesis. So the things we want to achieve are like setting something in place is hard because of the same reasons as what we want to achieve, like what we want to counter with it. So that's really hard. But like your point of having like a non-official commissioner, I think the Netherlands has that. So we have an observing Commissioner for Future Generations. It's basically just an NGO who appointed themselves and said, hey, I'm going to represent future generations now. I'm going to go on media. I'm going to talk to politicians. I'm going to do the work that needs to be done. And to be honest, I think that's quite fabulous. I think someone should do that in Tasmania. And maybe it can be a young person, maybe it can be you. You can just like do that. That just works. And I think that's great. Yeah.
Fabulous. Did you want to say something? Yeah.
Thanks. With indulgence as a legislator in the room, in terms of your question, how do we get this done, given that the situation looks very bleak in terms of getting something up, I can't stress more strongly that it's incredibly important to have frameworks and to have everything in place at any point in time, assuming that we're just about to have the door open where the opportunity will arise. We have to be ready. And that's the activist in me speaking, and as someone who's been in Parliament now, that is the way you have success. It is pushed from civil society. Anything that can be done to raise this as a normal conversation, as something which not only should be done but must be done, will build a conversation. And so, you know, as a Greens legislator, we will play our part in, thanks for this, it's amazing, using the language, looking at amendments in bills to require ministers to take those future generations into account in appropriate planning decisions, for example. There's so many opportunities. Look forward to that. But we collectively have to talk about and normalise this. I've got a question, if I can, and it's about human rights, and maybe to Peter or someone else who'd like to answer it. Is anyone around the world looking at, with countries that have bills of rights or the United Nations human rights, at adding in future generations into the charter? How, you know, it seems like it's important to marry them in there together into charters or bills of rights. And are we actually talking about changing language from rights to wellbeing? I think, because I think that's a valuable suggestion that Jan made.
Bridget, I'm going to throw that one to you to see if you have any insights that you can contribute.
Thanks. Certainly in other countries, there are bills of rights, constitutional rights that recognise future generations explicitly, and that really has opened up. When we were talking about the standing question before, it just makes that so much simpler because there's a right that's being recognised at the highest level. Colombia is an example of a country with a constitutional right that's then also paired with a pathway for claims to be taken to court when those future generations' rights are under threat. So that's producing really strong judicial outcomes for the benefit of future generations. And often those rights are linked quite closely to the right to a healthy environment. And that's probably at the international level where we're most likely to see some movement. It's really difficult to get international law to change at all. And I think probably the suggestion about shifting away from rights language might be a thing that could see more international movement. But we do now have at least the Human Rights Council's recent resolution recognising the right to a healthy environment. It doesn't probably go far enough in terms of recognising that on behalf of future generations, but it does acknowledge that future generations have these interests. So that development was heralded as something, you know, pretty momentous in human rights spaces, and lots of people campaigned for it for a long time. So it'll be, I think, you know, a space worth watching to see whether the General Assembly then picks up that language and does something similar.
Thank you. I'm just going to add something before you do. I note that when the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute recommended a Human Rights Act for Tasmania back in 2007, seems like a long time ago now, they included in it the right to a safe environment and to protection of the environment from pollution and ecological degradation. So they were saying back then that that was a sort of necessary part and a very Tasmanian, it seems to me, approach. So that's interesting. And I guess I'm sort of quite heartened by what's happening at the international level in relation to other human rights frameworks. So the Disability Rights Convention, there is very clear direction being forged in terms of the idea of transformative human rights. So the right to equality being transformative, not simply a response to, but actually changing the society and systems we operate in. And really we only achieve equality or a future generations equality through that transformative work that needs to be done. So I think there's some quite interesting debate going on.
Just really quickly, there's an absolutely inspiring decision that's been made by the German Constitutional Court earlier this year, based on fundamental rights that are embedded in the German Constitution, and this decision has forced the German government to upgrade not just its targets to 2030, but its whole process for making targets from 2030 through to 2050, and to ensure that the rights of future generations in Germany and young people that will be alive then will be respected. This is a really far-going decision that's been in the German constitutional system. The Constitutional Court has enormous power, and so Germany's now shifted to having one of the most progressive climate policy frameworks anywhere in the world through this constitutional decision, which is very much rights-based, human rights-based.
Thank you. Now, we are out of time, and I didn't even have to turn to my question, so thank you all for your engagement. I'm sure there's lots more questions online and in other places. I'm now going to, before I do this, please join me in thanking all our speakers on the panel. And I'm going to turn to the other bit of official business, which is to launch the book. So, as I anticipated, the speakers and the discussions have really stimulated me, and I hope all of you, to engage more deeply with the idea or the question of how do we ensure the voices of future generations are heard in decision-making here and now. With this in mind, launching this book seems like a very good thing to be doing. The book is called Giving Future Generations a Voice, Normative Frameworks, Institutions and Practice. And it seems entirely apt that this book is being launched in 2021, which is the first year of the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. And there was some talk about the importance of ecosystems this evening. We've heard this evening from most, but not all of the authors of chapters of this book, and they've given you, I think, a taste of what you can delve into in much more detail when you buy it. I want to acknowledge, in addition, the authors who weren't able to join us this evening. Elizabeth Dirth, who wrote on European approaches to institutions for future generations. Dr. Frederick Solto, whose chapter focuses on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its implications for future generations, and Drs. Alan Netherwood and Andrew Flynn, whose chapter focuses on the approach that you've heard about in Wales. Future generations, of course, can't come back in time to shake their fists at our political leaders and moneymakers and bring their proof of the harm that they will experience. This book shows that we need to make that metaphorically happen. And it provides some possible ways to do it, I think. It's a very readable book, and I think you agree that the panel was very easy to understand and listen to, and the book is similarly very accessible. It's written for a non-specialist audience. It's a book to stimulate and challenge our decision makers to break out of the business as usual practices and focus on justice for all, including future generations. Sadly, the impact of COVID-19 means that the books aren't here in physical form. They're still on a boat somewhere, I presume. But you can order it online by searching on the title, giving future generations a voice, and selecting the site for Elgar online, and probably other places as well. I'll just give you all the information I can. And I guess I want to just finish by saying the book wouldn't be what it is without the exceptional work of Jan Linehan and Peter Lawrence as editors. And I see nods from the authors, so that's always a good sign. They've drawn together a really engaging band of authors to create an important resource, not just for you and I, but for legislators and for decision makers, and to challenge us all to think differently. Please join me in thanking all of them and the authors, and to acclaim the launch of this book.
So I'd just like to add something to what Robin just said. First off, I'd like to thank Robin for leading us so brilliantly today, and thank you for your contributions to the discussion. I'd like to acknowledge that actually Nikki Van Dyke was really a very integral part of getting this book out in many different ways, and in organising this event tonight. And I'd like to thank all of the authors, those who are here with us, and the 4 who are not in different parts of the world. They were really the dream team. They were so incredible to work with, and I really thank them. And I make that thanks on behalf of Peter as well. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Chancellor. We like that.